We're thrilled to have you here, everyone. To begin with, we'd like to acknowledge the owners of the lands on which we meet, wherever we meet, the elders past and present, and we also acknowledge the ancient wisdom and light and plant medicine and other keepers of these medicines through the ages, which is why we know about them today and why they can be used as adjuncts to healing our patients. So today we primarily have psychiatrists on this, I believe, on this recording, though there are some other practitioners as well. It's very timely today because a trial study has just come out, the phase 3 trials, part 1 from MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy to treat PTSD. And the trial results are incredibly compelling with 67% remission rates from that cohort of 90 patients. All of those patients have an average length of PTSD for an average of 14 years. So one can imagine the suffering, and the fact that so many of them have gone into remission already is very, very good news, because in the MAPS phase 2 trials, 52% had gone into remission immediately, and then at the 12-month mark, 68% had gone into remission. So if it's 67% now, with further integration, it could mean that this particular group go into remission up to 80% of them, which would be an extraordinary outcome. So anyway, we're just going to show a very short video now first for those of you who are new. And we'll just, someone's putting something in the chat, I'm not quite sure. Okay, I'm not sure the answer how you introduce yourself, but welcome. And we're just going to show a short video now and then get on to the presentation. Thanks, Scarlett.
Devastates lives and families and costs Australia. Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
I can't sleep. Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. Subject to forthcoming clinical trial results, we will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
So thank you very much for that. And ladies and gentlemen, we encourage you to share that. And we'll now go on to the presentation. And during the presentation, Dr. Kotler and Dr. Dowie will each present some sections, and then we're going to have, I believe, as much time as we can for Q&A. So we're going to move through the presentation pretty quickly. That's the plan, so that we do end up with some time. And I just want to say again, you know, how thankful we are to all of you for joining us. We actually have been collecting, I suppose, a wonderful list of psychiatrists who are interested in this work. I think we have over 1,000 psychiatrists around Australia who've approached us and are interested in these treatments. And tonight we've had nearly 200 psychiatrists just register for this webinar. Not all of them are going to be on here because some aren't available but are getting the recording. But that's a fantastic amount of interest. And we salute you all for the work that you're doing in what is an increasingly troubling environment. So we'll move to the next slide. Thank you, Scarlett. So this is the scale of our mental health crisis. We're sure you know it, but pre-COVID, 1 in 5 Australian adults with a chronic mental illness, 1 in 8 Australians on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians and 1 in 30 children, with children as young as 4 being prescribed with antidepressants. 1 in 2 of us to experience a mental illness in our lifetime. Now, these figures have naturally exacerbated or been accelerated enormously due to the COVID crisis, and we haven't seen the new statistics yet. Next slide, thank you. So for the ADF veterans and first responders and certain other groups in society, the incidence of mental illness for them is far higher. That includes farmers, accountants, lawyers, and a whole range of others. Next slide, thank you. Massive impact on sufferers, families, carers. Numerous outcomes of mental illness include increased domestic violence, unemployment, increased, obviously, suicide and homelessness. And the cost to the Australian economy estimated at $220 billion by the Productivity Commission. Next slide. So unfortunately, there's been no improvement in treatment outcomes over the past 50 years or so. In the case of depression, only 30 to 35% of sufferers experience remission from current treatments. And of course, there's significant side effects, and a number of patients experience relapse after treatment stops as well. In the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, remission rates are as low as 5%. So a more of the same approach isn't going to solve the problem. And next slide, thank you. Next slide, which is why we set up Mind Medicine Australia. So Mind Medicine Australia was set up by Peter Hunt, my husband, and I in early 2019 to expand the treatment options available to wonderful practitioners like all of you on this webinar and your patients, through establishing safe and effective psychedelic-assisted treatments to cure a range of mental illness. And the primary focus for us at the moment with Mind Medicine Australia is on psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD. We are also interested in other psychedelic medicines. And for us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of the mental health and medical system. So that if you go to your practitioner, you will be given this as an option for your treatment, as a first-line treatment, with full disclosure on the risks and benefits of all the different treatments that you will be discussing with your patients. That the medicines will continue to achieve the high remission rates that they're achieving in current trials. In 160 current and recent trials, the remission rates have been generally between 60 to 80% remission rates across the last 10 to 15 years, which is really an extraordinary outcome with thousands of patients. And of course, it's very important that these medicines are accessible and affordable to all Australians in need, regardless of where they're located and their financial circumstances. Next slide. So we have a wonderful board. Ellie Kotler is on the board, who's speaking to you tonight. We have Admiral Chris Barry, the former head of the Armed Forces, Simon Longstaff, the head of the Ethics Centre, who says it's unethical for these medicines not to be made available to people who are suffering. and Andrew Robb, the former Trade Minister, who many of you will know has been suffering with treatment-resistant depression for the last 43 years, and at last count had probably tried 10 different antidepressants and other types of treatments as well. Next slide, thank you. And then we have our team, and keep sliding through these. Keep going. Scarlett, our ambassadors. Sorry, just go back on the ambassadors. So these are some of the leaders in the field. They've dedicated their lives to making these medicines available. Next slide. And then we have tons of psychiatrists. And if you're interested in being on our advisory panel and you're a psychiatrist out there, please reach out to us, because we really do welcome you to be part of this movement and to ensure that these treatments can be made available to those who really need them. Next slide, thank you, Scarlett. More psychiatrists. The next slide. Doctors, sorry, just back on that one. Doctors, emergency medicine practitioners, addiction specialists. Next slide. Clinical psychologists, behavioural scientists, researchers. Next slide. Pharmacologists, religious leaders, lawmakers, pharma, natural medicine. And next slide. Anthropologists, public health sector experts, and so on. And the next slide. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide. And actually, Trail, was that you going to be talking, going back on that slide? I'm just getting... Yes.
No.
This was where you were going to do a little bit of an intro, yeah?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to speak a little bit, and then Ellie's going to take over. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay. So I guess just to introduce myself for a moment, my name's Trey Dowie. I have a PhD in philosophy and also have a PhD in psychiatry, and have spent a lot of my life working as a psychotherapist and have been involved in the development of the clinical training for Mind Medicine Australia, which is just coming to an end for their first group, which has been very successful. We've had a number of psychiatrists, GPs and doctors in that program, and it's been very well received. Ellie wanted me to kind of just speak to a couple of, I guess, of the issues that we might think about more conceptually that this work kind of generates or arises. One of the astounding features, I think, which this work brings up is it can be quite extraordinary. You can be in a room with people who are essentially biological reductionists in their accounts of the world, and they can talk about how this medicine works. And then in the same room, you can have other people who are essentially making wide sweeping, essentially metaphysical claims. And one of the things that this work kind of brings up is a real questioning of the fundamental assumptions about what we think about human consciousness and how we understand its operation and work, and what its relevance is to clinical work. I'm always reminded by William James when he said, "No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves out other forms of consciousness, which are often quite disregarded." And one of the striking features is we have this incredible research data emerging with PTSD. And I know a lot of you will have spent large portions of your career working with that. It's almost hard to understand. How is it possible that we're seeing between 60 and 80% remission rates when, as Tanya spoke to before, we're often seeing 5%, maybe a little bit more with general treatments. And the central feature of these experiences is that they allow for people to occupy states of consciousness which are not otherwise available to them, and these seem to have the ability to change them. But even the term psychedelic is interesting. I mean, this notion of something which reveals the mind, something which allows one to see the mind, but it's often also used as a pseudonym for something like hallucinogen. And it's very interesting to recognize that the kinds of experience that occur on psychedelics can never really truly be understood as hallucinations. It's not really the right way to consider them, largely because of the fact that most people, when they're having a psychedelic experience, do not believe that those experiences are held by the people around them. There's a sense that they're real for them, but they're not available to other people. And of course, that's the kind of question of the hallucination and delusion, which we often see in kind of, psychotic clinical disorders. So there's lots of these interesting kind of philosophical questions. And one of the things that I think we have to face up to is that if the work that we've been doing and the work we've dedicated our lives to is essentially not working, then perhaps the way we've been thinking about the problem and the way we've been thinking about our treatment needs to be reinvestigated or thought through in a different way. And that's a lot of the work that I guess is currently being done in thinking about how can we apply this work into a clinical setting. And what I would say to that is there is a real opportunity here for us to redirect our approach in our treatment to something which is growth orientated, which is about growing and expanding rather than reducing. There's a focus here on capabilities and attributes instead of pathologies. And there's something, I think, very redeeming about that for us as clinicians, as well as for patients. There's something very, I'm going to use the word, there's something very beautiful about engaging in human life and human experience in a register which is actually full of hope. I was in a talk recently with Ben Sessa, and he's a very well-known psychiatrist from the UK who's involved in this work. And it was a very punchy line, it was a very punchy statement. He said, psychiatry is not palliative care. We should be seeking to cure people. And I was like, wow, that's a big statement, but it really jumped out at me. And so, my role in this work is to help train clinicians and to think about some of these broader problems. But I guess I just wanted to raise, in conversation with Ellie, that one of the effects of this work, and it is probably a resistant point, I think, for people intellectually, but also, in the field more generally, is it probably requires us to reimagine what we think we do and how we do it. And I think that's a real challenge for everybody, but I'm sure most of the people here are here today for that very reason, that they know that there needs to be something else. So, I only had 5 minutes, so I think that was my 5 minutes. Is that all right, Ellie? You want to jump in now?
Thanks, Charles. That's great. So Scarlett, I'm going to try and move through these slides pretty quick again so we can have some time. Hopefully there'll be a lot of discussions, and Charles, hopefully I did some questions.
Can I just ask you, Scarlett, too, if you could enable the chat so that people can start putting their questions into the chat from now, even though we won't answer the questions straight away.
Absolutely, will do. Thanks, Tanya.
Okay. So we're going to focus today on psilocybin and MDMA. That's purely because they're the ones that have been studied, but as people may know, there are a number of psychedelic compounds in existence. As Trell was mentioning, it's been a long time, I think, since psychiatry has used, I mean, we still may not use it, but ideas like cure, there used to be a psychoanalytic cure. And, depending on what you think of psychoanalysis, you may agree or not agree, but there was still a sense that maybe we can actually help people to the point of curing them. And I do think that that notion has almost disappeared from modern psychiatry. And I hope that this treatment, if it keeps, if the studies keep going how they are, it may actually bring back this idea that maybe we can actually cure people as psychiatrists. And, wouldn't that be nice? So next slide, thanks, Scarlett. So what are psychedelics? There are basically, if you sort of go to the organic chemistry, there are basically two types in terms of the chemistry. There are phenethylamines and tryptamines. The phenethylamines are things like MDMA and mescaline, and the tryptamines, things like LSD and psilocybin. Scarlett, if you could press the button twice, if you know anything about organic chemistry, that will mean something to you. It doesn't mean that much to me. You can go to the next slide, Scarlett. But one important, I guess, idea to realize is that most psychedelics are natural, come from plants and fungi and a couple of animals. But there are also two synthesized, well, there are multiple synthesized psychedelics, but two in particular which are important. LSD. You can go to the next slide, thanks. It's important to appreciate that LSD is structurally similar to serotonin, as we'll come onto the mechanism of action soon. You can go to the next slide. And MDMA is the other synthesized psychedelic. So there are two important synthesized synthetic psychedelics, which are MDMA and LSD, and the rest are naturally occurring compounds. Thanks, Scarlett. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanism of action. We'll go through it quickly. We could spend a long time on it, but we won't. And you can think about mechanism of action from a number of perspectives. I do just want to pause for a moment and contrast it against sort of the mechanism of action of antidepressants. To me, the mechanism of action of psychedelics is understood to a far greater extent than that of antidepressants. It's actually difficult to understand how antidepressants work because biologically we don't understand what depression is. You know, it's got something to do with serotonin, but it's got something to do with, you know, probably 20 neurotransmitter systems and neuroplastic changes, inflammatory changes. So how do antidepressants work? Well, we know they've got something to do with monoamines, but we don't actually know, you know, how they make people feel better, if they do. So we're going to talk about the mechanism of action. And yeah, I do think it's important to contrast it to existing treatments. So we'll first go to the molecular level. Thanks, Scarlett. So we know that, you can press it a couple more times. We know that if you block the 5-HT2A receptor, psychedelics no longer have their psychedelic effect. So 5-HT2A receptors appear to be necessary and sufficient for classic psychedelics. Next slide, thanks. MDMA is a little bit different. MDMA is an interesting molecule which does stimulate 5-HT2A receptors, but it does other things as well. It releases oxytocin, which is thought to be connected to attachment and connection. So for example, in nursing mothers release oxytocin. It also has a stimulatory effect through dopamine or adrenaline receptors, and also alpha-2 receptors cause a paradoxical relaxation, paradoxical in a sense, you know, relative to the stimulation. And there's something special about MDMA. I actually haven't had it myself, but from the trials, that people tend to be able to have this experience where they are triggered enough to sort of have emotions present, and, you know, potentially quite scary emotions, but feel safe enough and relaxed enough to actually sit with them, in addition to a psychedelic effect. Next slide, thanks. So where are 5-HT2A receptors that get triggered by psychedelics? They're most densely in the neocortex of humans. Next slide, please. And it's thought that they, particularly on GABA inhibitory interneurons, have a lot of 5-HT2A receptors, which means that triggering or an agonist or a ligand for the 5-HT2A receptor inhibits the inhibitory neurons. And if we go to the next slide, and basically what that leads to is your brain on psilocybin, which we can see here, against placebo. So a couple of things about this pictorial representation of neural network, of the connection of neural networks. The placebo one, there are as many connections on the placebo side as there are on the psilocybin side. It's just usually our brains are very rigid in how we think and feel and act, as you will all know with your patients, and some of you will also realize in yourselves that we are all very rigid in terms of how we relate to ourselves in the world. We're all stuck in our own patterns. If you're unlucky, you'll have unhealthy patterns, in which case you may be diagnosed with a mental illness and you will suffer in this world. But whether or not you suffer or you're reasonably happy, we're all pretty stuck in how we see ourselves in the world in terms of our thought patterns, our emotional patterns, and our behavioral patterns. What the disinhibition of the neocortex seems to do is it creates a massive neuroplastic change, initially functional neuroplasticity, but also structural, we know now. And that's basically what you see on the psilocybin side, that on the perimeter of the circle, those are all neural networks. And these are new connections being forged between neural networks that usually don't speak to each other. There's been particular emphasis on the default mode network, which is a sort of a resting state network. So if you put someone in a functional MRI and you tell them to do nothing, so you don't get them to do a task, but you literally just tell them, just close your eyes and do nothing, and you put them in a functional MRI, a particular network will light up. If you're like me, you'll realize that if you're told to do nothing, you won't actually do nothing, because your mind will start doing crazy things and thinking about anxiety-provoking thoughts and what I have to do and what am I doing now. And so the default mode network is thought to correlate with our ego or self-referential thoughts. And we know that particularly this network is disrupted under psychedelics. Next slide, please, Scarlett. Now, this relates to the theory on a theoretical level of how psychedelics work. And we really don't have time to go into this, but it's fascinating. And I really highly encourage you to read this article. The gentleman, the older looking gentleman with the graying hair, although his mind is brilliant, is Carl Friston. He's a psychiatrist and a neuroscience and a professor of neuroscience. He's described, I guess, the contemporary model of how the brain and mind work on a global level. This is what therapists have always known, and this will seem self-explanatory to some of you, but he's constructed mathematical models of the hierarchical neural networks in our brain. And to cut a long story short, how our mind and brain work is, as a lot of you will realize, is that we don't see reality. We see a prediction of reality, which is particularly based in our experiences. So our mind learns through experiences, and it then predicts what we see in the world. So for example, if my father beat me up when I was young, when I see someone that reminds me of my father, I'll be scared of them. And that's been explained mathematically now through the free energy principle of Carl Friston. This theory has now been expanded to psychedelics, and it's understood that psychedelics disrupt the hierarchical top-down control of our neural networks from the neocortex. What those neural networks do is keep us rigid and keep us fixed by predicting what we see in the world based on our past experiences. And psychedelics disrupt how we see the world and let us see things from a new perspective. Next slide, please. This is directly related to the phenomenological or subjective experience that people have on psychedelics, and Trail referred to this in a more eloquent way than I will. But it essentially allows people to have experiences such as connecting to unconscious material, connecting to emotions which they had not been able to connect to, access to emotional conflicts. There's a sense of losing that ego boundary, that controlling thought-related aspect of our minds that keeps us very much stuck. There's an increase in mental flexibility. There's a sense of connectedness with oneself, with other people, with the world. There's a development of, what the psychoanalysts would call emotional insight through experiential learning. And just to pause here and point out that the studies so far have correlated people's experiences with the effect sizes. In other words, it's people's experiences while taking these medications that is helpful. It's not simply a biological process, which is what Trail was referring to before. This is about people having experiences within a therapeutic session, within a therapeutic space, containing therapeutic safe space that allows them to explore themselves and explore underlying emotional conflicts. And that seems to be what is helpful and potentially curative. And so as people like Rick Doblin emphasize, it's the therapy that helps. It's not the medication. The medication facilitates an experience which is akin to intensive, emotionally based, insight-oriented therapy. And it's the therapy, so the medications facilitate therapy. but it's the therapy that is helpful. It's not simply taking a medication. Next slide, please. And this is reflected in what patients say about their experiences. So they use words like transformational healing. They use words like 15 years of therapy in one night. Interesting, you know, wars would be impossible to age, and that's part of the sense of connectedness that people feel. We could pause on that for a moment as well. If you think about the disconnection that people with chronic depression, chronic trauma states, chronic anxiety, there's so much disconnection, loneliness, and these medications particularly facilitate experiences like those. Next slide, please. This is just again to emphasize that it's the therapy rather than the medication. And so the medication is given within a therapeutic context. And this, these are the sort of protocols they're using in the studies, which is that there is a preparatory phase of at least 3 sessions. You know, if you have patients, you may want to do more sessions than that. You may want to do, you know, many sessions to prepare. But it's basically to prepare the set. You know, what's the patient going in with? What do they want to achieve? What are their issues? It's less a diagnostic interview and more an assessment of what is this person's issues, and what are their emotional conflicts, and what are their traumas, in order to get the person into a mindset of what they want out of this medicine. Then there's the actual sessions under the influence of a psychedelic, which go for a full day. One of the reasons psilocybin was used is because it's reasonably practical. It can be done in a work day, but essentially people have experiences for 6 to 8 hours, and in that experience, they have those subjective experiences, which I mentioned before. And then there's integration, and integration is key. So this is about, you know, what were my experiences? What do they mean? What feelings did I have access to? You know, what unconscious material came up for me, and what's the meaning behind those? And when the medications are couched in a therapeutic experience like this, then they work. And that's the difference between someone going to a club and taking MDMA and someone using MDMA in a therapeutic space. They're totally different experiences, and it's the experience which seems to be healing. Thanks, Scarlett. And just referring briefly back to what Trell mentioned, now this is a classic paper that many of you would have read in medical school or training as psychiatrists, that psychiatry seems to vacillate between mind and then brain. And I would suggest that more recently, psychiatry has moved towards a mindless approach, and it's focused much more on brain science. And I mean, what Leon Eisenberg was suggesting in this article is there really needs to be a balance. And I hope that these medications will rebalance mental health, in that we can take the brain seriously, but also really take people's experiences and life experiences really seriously as well. And that's going to be because these medications seem to work in a transdiagnostic fashion. They seem to work on the underlying conflicts and issues. So all of a sudden, diagnosis is going to be obviously still important, but it will be, you know, I guess the person's own narrative and their experiences and their traumatic experiences will become just as important in my diagnostic interview as the specific diagnoses, because all of a sudden I have a treatment for underlying emotional conflicts rather than a treatment purely for depression. Thanks, Scarlett. So I'll go through this briefly because we've got to keep moving, but just to emphasize that it's safe, that there hasn't been, to my knowledge, one serious adverse event in the thousands of participants so far in the psilocybin and MDMA trials. Next slide, thanks, Scarlett. And also it's important to note that on a population level in naturalistic studies, these substances are really relatively safe. Next slide, thanks. And just to emphasise that the effect sizes so far are much larger than our traditional treatment. So antidepressants effect size roughly 0.3. These effect sizes are often above 1, which hopefully continues as the trials continue. Next slide, thanks. And just again to emphasise the results are excellent so far, and again hopefully they'll continue with the phase 3 trial just coming out today. It's really exciting because it does look like it's going to continue. And you can see here remission and response rates of 80%, remission rates 70%, improving over time, like with therapy helps people, because again, it's the therapeutic experience which is healing. Next slide, thanks, Scarlett. And these are, I guess, the pivotal trials so far in treatment-resistant depression in England and PTSD in the States. And again, just to emphasize that so far, it's proven safe and very effective. Thanks, Scarlett. And again, this is the phase 3 MAPS trial, which is showing, again, excellent results, and we better keep moving. Thanks, Scarlett. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now. You're on mute, Tanya. You can't unmute yourself, it looks like.
Are you with us, Tanya?
I might continue.
Okay, got it now.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Yeah, just on that previous, if we just go back on that one previous slide about the direct comparison trial.
Sorry.
So just on the previous slide, maybe the previous one to that. Yeah, so this one is a really interesting study. I'll just mention it very briefly. So the first, whoops. Oh dear. I don't know. Oh, cool. So I'm having trouble with my emails. So this is the first direct comparison between psilocybin with an SSRI, escitalopram antidepressant, and twice the amount of patients went into remission who were on the psilocybin group than the antidepressant group. And that was after just 2 treatments with psilocybin combined with psychotherapy versus a daily dose of the antidepressant for the other group. The side effects also, were far less, and feelings of anxiety and suicidal ideation were also reduced in the psilocybin group. So that's pretty remarkable. Next slide, thank you, Scarlett. And the next one. So as some of you who were on at the beginning saw, that there's also trials now underway for treatment of anorexia and eating disorders, early stage dementia, obsessive compulsive disorder, a range of addictions, also looking at weight loss, schizophrenia and so on. And what we're seeing now is that these medicines are being made available through special access and compassionate use pathways. And these are for practitioners like yourselves to apply to the regulator, in our case the TGA, for approval to treat patients suffering from treatment-resistant PTSD or depression with these medicines. And there have been over 35 of these approvals granted in Australia so far. So at a federal level, the TGA is granting these approvals very quickly. Unfortunately, in most states around Australia, there's still recreational use laws, which basically prohibit bringing the substance into that state. So what's not happening in Australia is that we're not making, in the states, making the differentiation between recreational use and medical use of these medicines. And it's very important that there's a national standardisation that takes place so that these medicines are recognised as medicines and that medical exemptions can be granted so that you can then treat your patients who are very ill. Next slide, thank you. Yes, and we'll talk about the rescheduling as well in a moment. So, well, we'll talk about the rescheduling now. So Mind Medicine Australia put in rescheduling applications about last June to July. the interim decisions were negative in February, despite the fact that I think something like 540 of the 550 submissions from medical practitioners, consumers and the public were all supportive of both the rescheduling of psilocybin MDMA from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8, which is controlled medicine. So again, these medicines would never leave the clinic and they'd never go home with the patient. But as a result of further representations, many of the arguments given by the TGA were pretty lightweight, and we went back with resubmissions opposing those interim decisions, as did a lot of other people. And now the TGA have announced an independent review, and they'll meet some of the international experts in this field in the coming months. So that definitely provides some hope around the fact that these treatments will become available through SASB pathways more quickly. But as well, there's also a number of other opportunities for you to use these medicines through observational trials, and there's a number of new trials that are starting up, and we'll talk about those in a moment. And I have Peter Hunt with me here, and he'll talk about some of those. And we're also seeing the Australian government has just announced $15 million worth of funding towards, clinical trials, particularly we hope some novel research in Australia. And we acknowledge those of you from St Vincent's. There's quite a few, I think, psychiatrists from St Vincent's on this webinar. And of course, the very first trial which Mind Medicine Australia supported is taking place at St Vincent's at the moment for end-of-life anxiety and stress due to a terminal diagnosis. And typically speaking, the remission rates from those trials with end-of-life anxiety and stress have been 80%. And they went back on a New York University trial after 4.5 years last year and found that those patients were still in remission, and the majority of those patients were still alive, which was really remarkable. We're also seeing a number of states in the US decriminalising psilocybin, and in some states legalising psilocybin for therapeutic use, like in Oregon, California and other states following suit. And the Canadian government has also provided legal access to psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to help ease anxiety, and also now for PTSD. Next slide, thank you, Scarlett. These are some of the institutions with advanced R&D programs around the world: Yale, Harvard, Oxford, and we're seeing Monash and others coming in Australia now as well. And next slide. And we're also seeing, just in the last 2 years, 7 announced centres of excellence: Pure College, Johns Hopkins, next slide, Scarlett, and Shepherd Pratt, Mount Sinai Centre, particularly focusing on veterans' health as well and PTSD, and others that are starting around the world. And we hope to start a centre of excellence in Australia in partnership with some universities as well for the Asia Pacific. Next slide, thank you. So these medicines, next slide, have been with us since the beginning. They've been with us since ancient times. You can see them in the ancient archaeology of ancient Greece and Rome. They've been in the South American cultures, in the indigenous cultures of Australia and New Zealand. And in the 50s and 60s, just in the US alone, over 40,000 patients took part in Therapeutic, that is above ground, psychedelic-assisted therapy sessions, and were healed from a number of different conditions. And at that time, psychedelic-assisted therapies were considered the next big thing in psychiatry. And Stan Grof, a famous psychiatrist from that era who's still alive today, says psychedelics would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope is for astronomy. And then next slide, thank you, Scarlett. We had President Nixon, who politicized the use of all psychedelics and most other drugs in 1970. His aides acknowledged that they were lying about the drugs, that they knew just how prospective those treatments were, but they didn't care. And that's unfortunately what happens. And there was no scientific basis to, making these medicines or these drugs, turning them into a criminal use situation. But unfortunately, the outcome of that was that all research funding pretty much stopped at that point in time. And Professor David Nutt, who's one of our ambassadors, says that this is the worst censorship of research and medical treatment in the history of humanity. And if you think about it, the next slide, thank you. We have this lost 50 years where we've seen a major spike in a range of mental illnesses, loneliness and social isolation, which could have been treated. And we know that there's even a couple of psychiatrists on this call tonight who were actually around in the 60s and used some of these medicines to treat their patients and still have their case notes. And remember, this is the most exciting time in their career when they were getting a lot of their patients actually into remission from their conditions and getting them healed. So now we're seeing this incredible renaissance here of these trials. And you can see that we're back above where we were in 1970, finally. Next slide, thank you. We're also seeing a massive growth in for-profit companies around the world as people start to realise that the market place is so enormous. There's so much need in the community because so many people are suffering, and there's an enormous opportunity for for-profit companies who are looking at reinventing the molecules, manufacturing of the medicines, rollout of clinics. Next slide, thank you, Scarlett. And this is only a small snapshot, like probably when Peter and I started Mind Medicine Australia, there was only one for-profit, and now there's something like more than 50, with a new one pretty much starting every couple of weeks. Next slide, thank you. Next slide. So our strategy is to build the ecosystem. We run education and events like these, free webinars with some of the leaders in the field. We've had Robin Carhart-Harris, Dr. Gabor Mate, and many others. Thousands of people joining these webinars, learning about these medicines, including medical practitioners. We have a major medical summit in November. We invite you all to it. We'll give you a special offer to attend. And we also have chapters all around Australia. So if you're interested in learning more, join one of our chapters or start a chapter. We also have started the very first certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies. Dr. Dowie is one of the course leaders along with Dr. Nigel Denning. And Dr. Kotler is actually in the first intake of students who are graduating in the next week from that part-time 4-month course, which includes numbers of psychiatrists, GPs, psychotherapists, psychologists, social workers, mental health nurses, and others. And the next intake starts in late June and is pretty much nearly full, so you need to hurry if you want to be in that one. But then we're planning 4 intakes in 2022 as well. And we'll start to also roll out courses in other cities and towns around Australia, because we do want to make sure that rural and regional doctors are trained as well as capital city doctors. There you can see the Asia Pacific Centre in Mental Health for applied research and development that we're working on in partnership with some universities. And then, of course, the preferred legal and ethical frameworks, which we've spoken about, and rollout strategies for clinics. We'll just quickly move through the final few slides so we can get you through your questions. Next slide, thank you. So how can you help? Well, definitely join our chapters. We have a wonderful Learn section on our website with an enormous amount of journal articles and other research articles about this field. Talk to other doctors and medical professionals, because it's only by talking to people one by one that we suddenly start to see that people are really becoming more and more interested in this field and want to get involved. Peter and I are philanthropists, and we are generous, and we're donating our time and money entirely to this. But we can't do it alone. We invite you to donate. Many of you have donated tonight when you've registered for this talk, but if you have the capacity to be donors, we really encourage you to be. And we have a lot of psychiatrists who are supporting us as donors as well. Talk to your local MPs, that's very important, and attend our events, webinars, summit, and so on. Next slide, thank you. So this is the certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies, and we can answer more questions on that in the Q&A as well. And the next slide. Psychological support services is a support service we offer to doctors and psychiatrists and their patients who are using these medicines and who need further guidance for integration. This is perfectly legal. Sorry, whose patients are using the medicines, not the doctors using the medicines, whose patients are using the medicines. So that where your patients are using the medicines and need further integration or support, we have a service of psychologists and psychotherapists who provide additional support around Australia. That's led by Dr. Alana Roy, one of the psychologists who runs that with us. Next slide. So we've talked about the rescheduling. So let's all pray to the universe and all the schedulers that we can get this rescheduling happening. And the next slide. And this is who's speaking at our summit in November. It's an incredible lineup. We've already sold over 500 tickets for this. The first 2 days are an introduction to psychedelic-assisted therapies, and then the final 2 days are a range of keynotes and talks and hotspots and a gala dinner. It's going to be an amazing lineup of speakers, as you can see, but also some of the delegates who've started to apply. Very interesting mix of therapists, investors, philanthropists, the general public, business leaders and others, and politicians as well. So next slide. And then these are some of our upcoming events. So we have an interesting one with Dr. Albert Villalobos and Professor Nutt and myself on the healing power of psychedelics. I'm not sure where that one has gone again, the Carl Friston one on the 9th of June. Is it the 9th of June? It's not on here for some reason, but Ellie, you're doing a session with Carl Friston on the 9th of June. Sorry, if you can unmute yourself.
It's going to be awesome.
It's going to be awesome. I'm not sure why it's not on here, but it will be. And now we'll just open up, I think, to the chat. And the questions. So I'll just have a look at these questions. We'll go from the top. I'm going to go to there's a question here. Well, I think it's just a statement, really. I consider psychedelics to be holistic, enhancing on what is there, whereas antidepressants and allopathic are more allopathic in nature. Do you want to make any comment on that, Trail or Ellie?
I mean, yeah, I'll just mention that David Nutt and Robert Carhart Harris have released a paper. It's a theoretical paper. Obviously, I mean, but you know, it's David Nutt, so you have to take it very seriously. But on the supposed differences in mechanisms between things like SSRIs and psychedelics, because they both are sort of serotonin associated with increases or, you know, functional increases in serotonin. But the psychedelics tend to work through 2A receptors, and SSRIs and SNRIs work through 5-HT1A receptors. The 2A receptors are more neocortical. The 1A receptors are more subcortical. The 1A receptors seem to lead to sort of muted emotional responses, whereas psychedelics lead to more pronounced emotional responses. So I think that speaks to that comment.
Okay, thank you. So the question here on microdosing psilocybin and our views on it. So firstly, Mind Medicine Australia at the moment is not focused on microdosing. However, there's definitely a place for microdosing as a potential replacement for antidepressants, and also when people are tapering off antidepressants, for example, to trial or use these medicines for treatment. Did you want to comment on that at all, Ellie or Trail?
Yeah, I think it's too early to know. There are trials too early to know at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. Next slide, next question. What type of therapy is done with psychedelic-assisted therapy? Is it the usual PTSD therapy like CBT for PTSD or MDR? Or is it a specific psychedelic-assisted therapy? What is involved in specific psychedelic-assisted therapy? Trail, do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there's a few ways to answer it. I think the simplest way of talking about it is that psychedelic-assisted therapy is what we might call good old-fashioned therapy. That is to say that it needn't have an acronym associated with it. But when we're teaching it, the main focus is on metacognitively and mentalized-based treatment approaches. There's a good reason for that. One of the real problems in any state-based approach is how you stabilize states into stages or traits. And what we recognize through the history of psychedelic-assisted therapy is that it is the capacity for the individual to stabilize the experiences that they've had that lead to the beneficial outcomes. And so we prefer to kind of just open it up to a non-interference based model, where what we're doing is we're just doing lots of marking and holding to metacognitive experience. And that's the main focus we use when we're teaching. But there is a lot of research going on at the moment where people are applying specific models. So for example, at Yale, they're using ACT as part of their treatment protocol. I guess my feelings about that are that can be somewhat problematic. When people are using these substances, they're in such a vulnerable state. They're in such so easy to influence. They're in such a plastic state that the introduction of a conceptual model itself can have effects in terms of how people experience it. So really what we're often doing is trying to create a circumstance or an environment, particularly in a dosage session, where we talk about doing, not doing. There's a kind of attentive, holding, relating based space, but it is really to trust the person in their own experience. If they're on MDMA, then there'll be significantly more processing and interaction occurring. And then in the subsequent integration sessions, we use a number of different phases of integration. And these are designed to try and stabilize the state. And then we move into kind of general narrativization of experience. And that's our general approach to the therapeutic models that we're talking to and working to. But it's just too early to know. There may be significant outcomes with people using different models. My sense is that probably won't be the case. There's a lot of research in other fields that would suggest that that's not the case, things like transpersonal psychology and things like that. So yeah, we favor a kind of mentalized based approach.
Thank you for that. So there's a stack of questions here. I'm going to whip through them. We'll do quick questions, quick answers, so that we can get through more of them. From Dr. Chris Walsh, the brain is not the mind, just like the heart is not the circulation. The brain is the organ of the mind. Then how do we define the mind?
Well, you have to come to the course, because that's actually what we start night one with, is a description or a working description of mind, taking that concept seriously based on the interdisciplinary knowledge that we've achieved in neuroscience, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, cybernetics, etc. Because I think you're exactly right. Without a clear kind of understanding of what we're working with and how we're thinking about it, it can become problematic. So whilst we wouldn't claim that we've got the answer to that, we at least acknowledge that problem exists, and we try and generate something for you to work with.
Excellent. From Alicia Bates, has there been any recent evidence that psychedelics can aid in axonal shearing due to a TBI or repeated TBIs? How long after a TBI are patients no longer at risk of glutamate neurotoxicity if they undergo psychedelic-assisted therapy?
So from what I understand, there are trials starting, but I don't think I've seen a trial that's actually finished. But I know that people are excited about it. And there are companies investing money in it, even, I believe, which is amazing for psychedelics, because usually charities and not-for-profits run it, because they're not patentable, these medications. But I think in a year or two, we'll know a lot more.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, there's a comment here about we better include spirit here in this discussion. Without that, the plants and their synthesized version is going to be abused. Do you want to comment on that, Trail?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really valid kind of perspective. I mean, one of the tensions here is that we have to reframe and recontextualize how we think about these things. I mean, as Ellie said earlier, we want to take the brain and neurobiology very, very seriously in this work. but it also, the experiential register is central, and people have, and this is you know, there's a long history of this. People have experiences which profoundly change them, and those experiences are often described as mystical, for lack of a better word, particularly on psilocybin. And the question is, well, what's the relationship between people having those experiences and getting better, as Ali again spoke to earlier? It's actually that the more significant the experience, the more efficacious the medicine is. And so you actually can't do this work properly without at least paying some attention to that. Now, that might require the adjustment of various epistemological values that we all hold. But unfortunately, if we are going to practice this work in a meaningful and scientific way, it does actually require us to acknowledge that there are factors here that are outside the register of mere biological description. There are experiences which are important and relevant. And so, yeah, we have to take that seriously. What that is, I don't know. I mean, it is also important, on the other hand, I think, not to jump into making, you know, overly extended metaphysical claims of the supernatural. I mean, I think it's a tension between those states that we need to hold and we need to think about. And I look, as someone who's been involved with this work and the thinking around it, you know, I know that for myself, I found it very problematic at times to reconcile what I would describe as essentially a scientific and reductionist and a rationalistic approach to the world, and contextualize that within both personal experience and the experience of others. And, you know, you have to reform those views if you're going to take this work seriously.
Thank you for that. There's a question here, very interested in cost effectiveness studies for MDMA for PTSD, given the lengthy supervision required, the fact that most people don't get existing psychotherapies in the public sector. I'd really like to see everyone get access to EMDR before they have a treatment, which would very likely be far more expensive. Peter, did you want to make a comment on that?
You know, just on the cost of the therapy, I mean, the question is quite right that you've got significant upfront costs because you've got a lot of therapist time. We're doing our best to make sure the medicine costs are as low as possible. But what you're doing is you're comparing more significant upfront costs with the ongoing cost to a human being of taking antidepressants year after year or going to psychotherapy year after year, and the effect of that on their health and well-being. One of the things we're going to be doing is an economic model to actually compare the two, but economic models will be done overseas, particularly in the States, and they've shown that if you take a net present value for those who get into that sort of stuff, these therapies are actually a lot cheaper than people not getting well if their remission rates stand up. In the early days, inevitably, poorer people will find it more challenging to access these therapies. And one of the things we're going to be trying to address is to make sure that governments understand that these therapies should be available equitably across Australia. And that's one of the benefits of being a not-for-profit.
Yeah. If I can just make a comment there on the other part of the question, I think that's, you know, Peter's spot on there. I mean, in terms of the efficacy with things like EMDR, I mean, I think it's important to point out that whilst the EMDR in some research is shown to be highly efficacious, in other research, particularly head-to-head research, it's often just in the normal ranges of therapeutic efficacy. Whereas what we're talking about here are substances that are wildly more effective in the current trials, like, you know, night and day differences. So I just wanted to point that out.
And I'll just point out very quickly that MAPS have done modelling, and don't quote me on this, but it was something like in the MAPS phase 2 trials of 100 people, it was a saving of $100 million over 30 years. Don't quote me on that though, but it's something like that.
100 billion.
But also the Scientific American recently said that the cost savings for people with treatment-resistant PTSD would be in excess of $100,000 per patient, which is significant. Question here from Kayla, which I'll answer. Will the summit presenters be attending live or via web? So we hope that we can get as many of the presenters in the room as possible. We already know some of them are Australian, so we can get some of them in. And we know that some of the overseas presenters are prepared to quarantine as well because they want to come and they want to be part of this. So we anticipate that quite a lot of the presenters will be in the room. A couple of the older ones, like Dr. Gabor Mate, will probably be online, but he's also awesome online. So, and he's about 78, 79 now, so we don't want to make him travel too far. But the majority will be there online. And I want to give you all a password, which is MMA 2021, if you want a 10% discount to any packages to the summit. That is my offer to you now. And there's an early bird special that finishes on June the 30th. And we anticipate that the summit could sell out in the next couple of months. Gavin, very interested in cost effectiveness. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you've answered that one. Sorry, that's a repeat.
Sorry. Is the RANZCP still opposing rescheduling? And if so, how can they be influenced to support our efforts? Peter, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's unclear at the moment because the clinical memorandum put out by RANZCP is now more than 12 months old, and it was put out before these results came through from both the MAP study and the Imperial College study. RANZCP really was one of the only parties opposing the rescheduling. I think 98% of those who put in submissions were supportive. But hopefully what's happening now is that there's internal debate within RANZCP, and they're starting to look more at the data and the science from overseas, and hopefully that leads them to being part of this independent inquiry in a really positive way. But time will tell.
How can they be influenced to support our efforts?
Well,
there's lots of psychiatrists on here.
I think the main thing with the psychiatrists on this call, I mean, you're all members of our RANZCP, and it'd be great just to have some internal debate within the organisation about the pros and cons. And even better if RANZCP would be prepared to listen to overseas experts. And we've made that offer to them on a number of occasions that we'll organise that. So perhaps, internally you can encourage that to take place. And I think in the conference next year, they're talking about having psychedelic therapy on the conference.
I don't want to reveal that to you because you might not have been revealed it yet.
But things are moving, and hopefully, as I say, if the psychiatrists on this call can really encourage debate within the organisation, that will lead to people really focusing on these amazing trial results that we're seeing from overseas.
I think, also it would be really good for you to have a conversation with people like the new president, Vinay Lakra, and people like that, just to make sure that their minds are really open and that the clinical memorandum is actually adjusted to reflect fact, to affect science and data. So any of you that can, influence that process and to ensure that a clinical memorandum is accurate, I think that would be particularly important right now. And, just advocate to the college how much all of you want to heal your patients and how that important that is to you, because at the end of the day, the college cares about you as members, and and this is important for everyone's career to actually be able to feel like they could heal their patients. Question here from Toby: have they done studies comparing the psychedelic ceremony with the ayahuasca? Well, shaman versus a Western psychologist in a clinic? I don't believe so, Toby. No.
But there are a few studies on the UDV religion in Brazil. There has been a few studies done. They're not. I mean, obviously they're not. Double blind, they're not those kinds of studies. But there is some research out there, Toby, if you're interested in it. I think it might have been done by Berkeley or something like that. But it was if you look up, something like UDV religion Brazil psychedelic research or something, you might find something.
Okay. Karen, given the certificate of psychedelic-assisted therapies is a large time investment, 90 hours and the cost 9K, this could be a large barrier for time-poor psychiatrists and psychologists. Well, it hasn't proven to be, Karen, because all our intakes are completely full with a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists in them. So we really strongly encourage you to be part of that one. And Ellie, how have you found that against your workload as a full-time psychiatrist?
Look, a lot of it's on the weekends. There's essentially 1 week that needs to be taken off, but apart from that, I've found it manageable in terms of time, but there is 1 week that needs to be taken off.
And how have you found the course? I mean, you might as well share that with everyone.
Yeah, and I might also answer Ben Chia's question while I'm...
Okay, great.
Yeah, look, the course has been fascinating, both in terms of what we've learned, but also in terms of the people. It's been an amazing experience to, I guess, you know, a group of 50 people, very interesting people, and also multidisciplinary, which is really nice. You know, I never get time to just hang out with psychologists, mental health nurses, social workers, chiropractors, other psychiatrists, and just to really share our experiences and different ideas, because, you know, we tend to be a little bit siloed. Even if we work with multidisciplinary teams, it's not often that we just get to, you know, talk to people and meet them on a personal basis and speak to them about their work. So both on an information level and also on a connection level, it's been quite special. And Ben, yeah, we can't, obviously, for obvious reasons, we can't experience MDMA or sit for someone who's on MDMA, but we do experience an altered state of consciousness through holotropic breath work, which I won't speak in detail about, is something I knew nothing about. And I must admit, I was quite skeptical going in, but I certainly had an experience of an altered state of consciousness, and it was a remarkable experience for me. I won't go into the details, but I'm happy to speak about it if anyone wants to ask me personally. But I do get a sense now of what it means to have my ego dissolved and, you know, be open to unconscious experiences and emotions and feel connected. And so there is an analogue of MDMA assisted therapy, which is holotropic breath work. So, yeah.
And I mean, we should also mention, can we mention this?
Yeah, the other thing that we're working on is what's called a healthy persons trial. In both America and Canada, the regulators have got their minds around the fact that therapists doing this training really should have the option of experiencing the medicines in a therapeutic environment. And that's something that we're actively working on.
So that's pretty exciting for those of you who are planning to do our future intakes, that you will hopefully get the chance to actually experience the medicines.
But I should just stress very clearly that everything my medicine does is in cooperation and observance of the regulatory environment. We don't do anything which goes beyond what is legally allowable in Australia.
Just for that other question too, we are running some weekend workshops, shorter courses. We have a 2-day introductory workshop at the summit, but that won't give you the qualifications. So if you do want to practice, you know, in a clinic with patients, or be part of observational trials or in these other trials or the healthy patients trial, then you do need to actually register for the CPAT course itself. But do we know what other medical conditions could benefit from psychedelic-assisted therapy? Bipolar, for instance, symptoms, easing symptoms of mania and hypomania. Ali, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So there is the world of trials, and then there's the real world. The world of trials is currently excluding people with psychotic illnesses and bipolar type 1, as far as I understand. But there are a number of conditions which have been researched, and I'll answer a couple of the questions as well in this. So addictions, it looks really exciting. There's old work from the 60s and 70s with LSD, which doesn't come up to our standards today, but is very promising. And there's research by Ben Sessa in England with alcohol, showing, you know, a remission from alcohol use disorder in 75% of people at 9 months versus treatment as usual, which was about 20%, 21% remission. So there's really promising work. And again, you know, if addiction is understood as a post-trauma condition, there's no reason why the results can't be as good as the PTSD trials. There's also, I saw someone actually mentioned social anxiety in autism. There's been a trial of social anxiety in autism showing excellent results, which again brings up interesting questions about what is autism. You know, if psychedelics can help with social anxiety, you know, brings up really interesting questions like this. But yes, there is, again, I can't remember the trial, but you could look it up, social anxiety in autism. There's trials in eating disorders, in existential death-related anxiety with people with cancer diagnoses, smoking, excellent results in smoking, OCD, neurodegenerative disorders, opioid use disorders, cluster headaches, conversion disorders. There's a whole range. And again, it speaks to the transdiagnosis. I mean, again, if we understand psychiatric illnesses and diagnoses as resulting from experiences in people's lives, then you can start to understand that, these medications could potentially help in a very wide range of disorders. It's just that research is research, and research has to go by a particular diagnosis, because that's the world of research. But it's very exciting in terms of multiple diagnoses.
Excellent. Question here, how to overcome the challenges in translating to real world setting where most of the therapists operate individually? So here we have this team approach. Trail, would you like to comment on that, or Ellie?
Yeah, I'm happy to just say a little bit about it. I guess the nature of the work requires us to work in a team. That just purely the length of session, for example, where we're talking 6 or 8 hours, having someone else to work in a dose session is essential. You can't really do it by yourself effectively. You don't want to be having to go to the bathroom and someone open their eyes and find they're in a room by themselves, and you could all anticipate the damage that something like that could do. But also there's multidisciplinary skills that are required, and this has been probably the most interesting thing about the first CPAT group. Is I think there's been a real appreciation of the differences. I think psychiatrists have really appreciated the skills of the psychotherapists. The psychotherapists get a real appreciation for the knowledge of doctors and psychiatrists, and their understanding of medicine and pharmacology, because of the potential risks. Obviously, the treatment will require, strong medical safety, and so there is almost an essential requirement for a prescription doctor to be involved in the process in some form. And so, as I said earlier, I think one of the things that this work does is it really demands us to reconceptualize and rethink about what we think treatment is and how we think work should be done. I mean, it requires a radical reimagining, I think, of a lot of the things that are taken for granted at the moment.
Thank you for that, Trail. A question here, the current RANZCP clinical memorandum states psychedelic substances are illicit substances and cannot be prescribed or administered outside of properly approved research trials. It would be hard to prescribe if our college guidelines is such. I'll let you answer that, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where I think for the members of the college here tonight, get the debate going with a focus on what's happening in overseas trials to really analyse whether that statement is a fair statement. There have been new trials announcing results since that came out. The other thing to point out is that one of the things that's being looked at now is observational trials as a way to enable psychiatrists who feel uncomfortable because of this clinical memorandum to actually participate in providing these therapies. I would just highlight one thing, and I think it's a real illustrative of the mindset of the person who wrote that clinical memorandum. They describe psychedelic substances as illicit substances. Now, that's actually quite an emotional comment, illicit substances. A substance by itself shouldn't be illicit. It's how you use it that's either illicit or not illicit. There are many medicines that, if they're used in the recreational environment, would be described as illicit, but they're still medicines. And it's that sort of point that we really just need to have the debate about, that a substance in itself isn't bad, it's how you use it.
Like
I can confirm that because of the clinical memorandum, psychiatrists in Victoria can't prescribe MDMA even under compassionate use at the moment. So I can confirm that comment is true.
Thank you. There's a question, sorry, did you want to, no. Is there anywhere we can get a look at the psychedelic-assisted therapy sessions in practice? The answer to that one is yes. So for example, there's a documentary called Trip of Compassion, an Israeli documentary that follows 3 patients through MDMA-assisted therapy in Israeli hospitals. The first time that, cameras have actually been allowed into a hospital to actually film patients, and that It was really just done for archival purposes, but they found it to be so compelling that they asked the patients if they'd mind if they turned it into a documentary, and 3 of the patients agreed. And Trip of Compassion is available on demand as a video. We also regularly have screenings, and it really is one of the most powerful documentaries, and it shows the patients going through the process, their original traumas, and then it shows them a year later, still in remission. So it really is remarkable. That's what got you into this, didn't it, Ellie?
Yeah, I saw that documentary and I contacted you guys.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's also there's quite a bit of other documentaries available through our website and other places that you can see more of this on. Question here, who's going to protect clinicians who are the pioneers in both prescribing psychedelic medications, providing psychedelic-assisted therapies, from either litigations or investigations by APRA if there are even minor adverse events? If you're outside of a research study, it would seem to me you could be at risk of professional ruin if you jump in too early. Peter, do you want to comment on that one as well?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the first thing is obviously to look at the results that are coming out of trials overseas to see the caliber of the data and the fact that it's showing that these therapies are safe and they are effective. The second thing is that in order to use these therapies, you're going to need to have the approval of both the TGA and the local state Department of Health, 2 regulatory bodies. The third thing psychiatrists may well want to do is get the views of fellow psychiatrists in relation to the patient and the relevance of the particular treatment. So I think if you go through in those sort of stages, now there's a risk with everything in life, but I think the risk can be minimised. Ellie, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, initially, depending on, I think a significant amount depends on the college memorandum. For example, if the college memorandum suggested that for compassionate use, it's reasonable to consider MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, I think you'd be pretty safe. As the college memorandum states at the moment, one could argue that you are putting your neck out to do the treatments, which is a shame. So yeah, I mean, I take the point.
The pioneers like you, Ellie, I mean, obviously you're seeing this as something that's very important for you in treatment of some of your patients, and you're prepared to stick your neck out. Many others are. And of course, around the world, no psychiatrist so far has had any issues with any of these compassionate use or other schemes.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to debate someone on the data of using it for compassionate use, where there's a treatment-resistant patient with complex PTSD who's had, 30 medications and 20 psychotherapies, and they themselves are requesting the treatment and they themselves are consenting, I think, I certainly, and if it was weighed up in a court of law, I think, the weight of evidence would swing towards, the psychiatrist and their patient, but, who knows?
Yeah, thank you. So just some of these other questions, how do we get approved to do a study? I want to do a psilocybin depression trial. By all means, reach out to us with any ideas about, your trials. If we can support you in some way or connect to you, others we will. The fact that plants are illegal is nuts. I agree, Toby. It's terrible to think that, we could go out into the forest today and pick a poisonous mushroom and it wouldn't be a criminal act, but if we picked a psilocybin mushroom, it would be. What is the world coming to?
But whilst we agree with all of that, it's not what my medicine is about. My medicine is about using these medicines legally.
Correct.
Within a proper regulatory environment, with proper controls as part of our medical system. And yeah.
And then are there opportunities for students to be involved in current upcoming research? Again, if you want to get involved, reach out to us. We'll work out any ways we can to help you and join the dots and just get involved and support us, be part of this movement. And I think that together, we can get these medicines and treatments to people who need them desperately. And this is personal for every single one of us because, this is affecting our loved ones, our colleagues, our families. And we need to all just reach out our hands and try and find a way to make these medicines accessible as soon as possible. And yeah, we see there's just so much happening right now. I think that we will see the first treatments through SASB in the next few months in Australia, and a number of exciting observational and other trials being announced as well. With that, I think I'd like to thank you both, Dr. Ellie Kotler, Dr. Trail Dowie, for your great work, your support always to our organisation, to all of you other doctors on this call. I mean, your work is so valuable, and we pay tribute to you all for caring deeply for your patients and wanting to find ways to heal them, and anything we can do to support you, we will. And we hope to run more regular sessions for psychiatrists. So we might run, psychiatrist information sessions every 2 or 3 months, depending on Ellie and Trail and others. But we welcome you to join, and please, with your other colleagues, encourage them to sign up, and then they'll hear about it as well. So next time we can have twice as many people attending. But we look forward to seeing you all again, and please come to the summit. And Ellie, did you want to say anything else?
Just that, I think we're headed for a really exciting time for mental health and psychiatry. And I think, maybe in 10 years, psychiatry will look totally different. And I think it's really exciting time to be a psychiatrist.
Fantastic. Trail, did you want to finish with one closing comment for everyone?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just hope that tonight has been helpful and it's piqued people's interest. Like, I'm one of those people who's not a true believer in, recreational psychedelics or any of those kind of things. I'm really interested in its clinical applications and its clinical settings, and I'm super excited about it. And I hope today's helped you get excited about it as well. I think it can make a world of difference. So.
Oh, thank you so much, guys. And Trail, love to have a quick chat with you after this. We'll give you a quick buzz.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. And please support Mind Medicine Australia and share this information. We will be releasing the recording, and you're welcome to share it, of course, with your colleagues widely. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Have a great evening. Thank you.